You've heard the term a million times, right? On the news, in articles, GDP is up, GDP is down. It's this huge number that seems to control everything. But what exactly is gross domestic product? And what does it really tell us about our economy and even our lives? Well, let's dive in and break it all down. It all really boils down to this one simple question. It's the question on everyone's mind, from economists and politicians right down to you and me. But how do you even begin to answer that? How do you measure the health of an entire country's economy with all its millions of moving parts, every coffee you buy, every car that's built, every job that's created? To really get why we need a number like GDP, we have to rewind the clock back to the 1930s. During the Great Depression, everyone knew things were an absolute disaster. The economy was in a total freefall. But here's the crazy part. Leaders at the time had no real way to measure just how bad it was. They couldn't tell if their policies were helping or hurting. They were basically flying blind in the middle of a hurricane. So it was out of this crisis that an economist named Simon Kuznets was tasked with a huge job: come up with a way to measure everything a country's economy produces. And he did. He created a tool that would become the single most powerful economic number in the entire world. And here it is: gross domestic product, GDP. It sounds complicated, but the core idea is actually pretty straightforward. You just add up the dollar value of every single final good and service produced for sale inside a country over, say, a year. Every car, every phone, every doctor's visit, all of it. It's kind of like the ultimate report card for an economy. So just how big can this number get? Well, for the United States in 2020, the GDP was almost $21 trillion. That's a number so big, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around. It's the value of everything the country made and sold in one year. But what in the world actually makes up a number that massive? So where does a number that big come from? Well, to figure it out, we don't just look at what's being made, we look at who's doing the buying. And it turns out it all breaks down into a pretty simple formula. Think of the economy as having four main shoppers. First, there's you and me, regular people buying stuff. That's consumption, or C. Then you've got businesses buying new factories and software. That's investment, or I. Then, of course, the government is a huge spender. That's G. And finally, you have the rest of the world, which we call net exports. That's simply what we sell to other countries minus what we buy from them. You add it all together, C plus I plus G plus net exports, and boom, you've got GDP. And when you look at how these pieces stack up for the U.S. economy, one of them is, well, just enormous. Check it out. Our personal spending, that's consumption, makes up over 2/3 of the entire economy. It's so big and steady that some economists call it the gentle elephant. It's massive, but it doesn't tend to change too erratically. Okay, now here's a super important rule when you're calculating GDP. You have to avoid something called double counting. Think about it like this. When a brand new truck is sold, we count that final price in GDP. But what about the tires that Ford brought to put on the truck? If we counted the tires and the final truck, we'd be counting the value of the tires twice, right? So to avoid that, statisticians only ever count the value of the final product. The value of the tires is already baked into the truck's price. All right, so we get how GDP is measured. But there's a catch, and it's a really big one. That huge number we've been talking about can actually be a bit of an illusion. And the culprit? Inflation. Take a look at this chart. This is what's called nominal GDP. It's just the raw number measured in whatever the prices were that year. And you can see back in 1960, it was around $500 billion. By 2020, it had exploded to nearly $21 trillion. That growth looks absolutely insane. So does that mean we were actually producing 38 times more stuff in 2020 than we were in 1960? Well, no, not even close. A huge chunk of that increase didn't come from making more things. It came from the prices of all those things going way, way up over 60 years. And this brings us to this really crucial difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP, the one we just saw, can be super misleading because of inflation. Real GDP is the real hero here. It's been adjusted to strip out the effects of rising prices. It gives us a true measure of whether we're actually producing more goods and services. It's the number economists always look at to see how the economy is really doing. Let's look at that chart again, but this time with real GDP next to it. See the difference? After you adjust for inflation, the economy back in 1960 was actually about $3.2 trillion. and by 2020, it had grown to 18.4 trillion. Now, that's still an amazing six-fold increase, but it's not 38 times. This gives us a much, much more honest picture of the actual growth. So, how do we actually use this stuff in the real world? Well, economists rely on real GDP to track the health of the economy, to spot trends, and to understand the natural rhythm of how economies grow and shrink. You see, all economies go through these cycles. You get these periods of growth, called an expansion, where real GDP is climbing. Eventually, that growth hits a peak. Then, a significant period of decline in real GDP is what we call a recession. The very bottom of that is called the trough, and then a new expansion begins. Tracking real GDP lets us see this whole cycle play out. But just the total GDP number doesn't tell you the whole story, especially when you start comparing different countries. Look at this. China's total GDP is actually bigger than the US one here. But look at the GDP per capita. That's just the total divided by the population. The US is way higher. That gives you a much better clue about the average standard of living. Or look at Germany and India. Germany's economy is much smaller overall, but its GDP per capita is almost 9 times higher. And that brings us to our last, and honestly, maybe our most important point. For all of its power, GDP is not a perfect report card for a country's well-being. It's great at measuring the size of the economic factory, but it doesn't tell you much about the happiness of the people working inside. This quote really hits the nail on the head. Our standard of living is about everything that affects our well-being, and a lot of those things, maybe even the most important ones, don't have a price tag. Just think for a second about all the important stuff that GDP completely misses. It doesn't count our leisure time or how clean our air and water are. It doesn't directly measure how healthy or educated we are. It totally ignores all the valuable work that happens at home, like raising a child, because no money changes hands. And maybe most importantly, GDP tells you nothing about who gets the money. A rising GDP could mean we're all a little better off, or it could just mean the very rich are getting much, much richer. So where does that leave us? Well, GDP is an absolutely essential tool. It's a vital sign for the economy's health, but it's not the whole story of our lives. It tells us how much we're producing, but it can't tell us what makes that production worthwhile. Which leaves us with a final, bigger question to think about. If this one number can't capture everything that truly matters, how should we really be measuring our success?